All right, everybody, we're here today with, of course, you know Brian, myself, I'm Randy.
Hi, everybody.
And here with a good friend of ours, Tim Jahn. He's a hell of a painter. He's a good friend. And Tim's going to talk to us today about his feelings on... What are you going to talk about, Tim?
We're going to talk about the fall of drawing in art, brought on by Impressionism. And
it's a great subject.
He's a real serious guy.
Yeah, it's a great subject, but before we get into that, Tim's got a little puppy dog here. And
yeah, we got a little puppy dog here.
Puppy dog. That's the corporate mascot, if you will.
That's right, and this is Spartacus, and he doesn't like Impressionism either, right?
He's got issues just like Tim does.
That's right. Yeah, he's got issues too. Yeah.
So we're going to sit back and listen to Tim ramble for about 8 or 10 minutes on this subject here.
So what we were talking about off camera before we started was the fall of Impressionism, or the fall of drawing and brought on by Impressionism. As we move through art history, we have an unbroken line of information from the Renaissance all the way up until about 1900. Impressionism starts in the middle of the 1850s. You're really stuck in this Dark Ages.
Yeah, I want to know about the Dark Ages.
As we come out of the Dark Ages,
people died from the plague in the Dark Ages, we heard.
Artists and craftsmen come out and start to do things. You know, there were craftsmen that then become artists, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, so on and so forth. From that point, the academies were introduced, and you have an unbroken line of information passed on orally from generation to generation to generation. As we get to Impressionism, though, all of a sudden the information stops. My problem with Impressionism is that because of a select few artists that were horrible draftsmen and probably would have been forgotten in history had it not been for a few savvy business people, alone, just a few artists ended drawing instruction entirely in art schools.
Now, Tim, let me interrupt you real quick.
Sure.
You showed me a photo before from an Impressionist book. Who is it, Cézanne?
Cézanne.
I thought it was a terrible rendering of whatever. Why is this gentleman in a museum?
That's a very good question.
Why was he called, he's called what? He's called the, what is it, all the landscape painters say he is the king?
No, that's Elvis.
Oh,
that's Elvis.
That's Elvis.
Right.
So he's the maestro.
I guess they would.
Everybody says it all came from Cézanne.
It all came from Cézanne. Well, I think people like to tout Cézanne because when you look at Cézanne, you realize that, well, boy, I really don't.
Like that.
I could paint like that. You know, he draws pretty bad, and my nephew, who's 5, draws about as well as Cézanne.
I mean, I always said everything came from Rembrandt and Velázquez.
Well, yeah, and I would say it all comes from Michelangelo or
No, but
Da
the
Vinci,
style in which we paint. The style in
Sure.
which we paint with the brushes and the mixed colors and blocking in a head, really the first 2 known artists to paint that way were Rembrandt and Velázquez. I'm sure there were other painters doing it at the time, but you could see them change from an underpainting and a drawing to just blocking in a painting.
Right.
And I think everything comes from Rembrandt and Velázquez.
Yeah, and you've always had sort of 2 camps or 2 schools of thought. Rembrandt and Velázquez belonging to the painterly school of thought, and David, neoclassicism, and Bouguereau sort of ascribing to a more finished or polished school of thought.
Right.
So you've always had that dichotomy that has run through. Impressionism took the painterly style of Rembrandt and Velázquez and the crummy drawing of somebody who's naive or drunk or retarded, and put that together as a style. They could quickly produce things and outpaint, in terms of volume, anybody who was really actually trying to draw what was there.
So you say that it was just shock value.
I would say that shock value had a lot to play with it because
They were trying to shock the public to get a response to make themselves famous.
Monet and Manet were asked at the 1900s World's Fair who would be remembered 100 years from now as the best painter of your generation. Unequivocally, they looked at each other, just like we are at each other, and they said, Bouguereau. Bouguereau will be the one person that's remembered. Most of you people, if anybody's watching this, probably doesn't know who Bouguereau is. You all know who Manet and Monet are. Now, I went to art school, and it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I really knew who Bouguereau was. or the important role that he played of his generation.
He was teaching them.
He was teaching them. Fantin Latour was teaching them. Fantin Latour was probably more responsible for that group of Impressionists than anybody else. He was experimenting in color.
Tim, you think it's possible that not everybody knows about Bouguereau because there's only one book, if you can even find it on Bouguereau?
That has a lot to do with it, but
it's also the Impressionists becoming famous in the late 1800s, going into the Post-Impressionists, going into Abstract Impressionism, leading from that. Yeah, the realist artists just fell off. And the realist painters in the mid-1900s were considered boring.
Sure.
It wasn't a new thing. So there's always
a
shock of the shock value and the new and exciting value.
So let me ask you a quick question. Pointillism, is that part of Impressionism, would you say?
Part of
it was a scientific research.
Well, it is. It almost goes Pointillism almost goes into Post-Impressionism, where you start breaking up the form. Impressionism is the study of the color of light hitting objects, but you're losing drawing. You're just painting the light, the colors, and the light. Sure. But you still have to have values to have form. When you get to Post-Impressionism, you start losing all form altogether. You get more flat or cartoon images, or very flattened images like Gauguin, or broken up images like Van Gogh. Right. And then you go into Cubism. Cubism is playing off the planal values of things and showing you more than one side at a time, is what it's doing. It'll turn the sides out, turn the top up, and let you see different areas in Cubism, and break the drawing even more. But, a lot of the first ones that did it, even though they weren't the best draftsmen in their class, and they did come up with this new exciting thing which made them become famous. You also have to remember something at the time. There were no movies. The actors and actresses, the famous people of the day, were, for the most part, artists, and were performers in plays, and they were visual artists. So they were the superstars of the day. And anything it took to make you a superstar, you're going to use. So if you can't draw as well as the traditional painter in your class, and you find something of shock value that people talk about you and write about you in the newspaper, you're not going to keep doing that? Of course you are.
Do you think it's much like some of the things today in galleries people sell what is pretty and that people like?
I think it wasn't even pretty. What do you think? I don't even think when it first came out, Impressionism wasn't considered pretty. It was considered ugly.
Yeah,
it was grotesque to them. They were unfinished paintings.
Right, it was crude. It wasn't as highly polished as the French style, and it was disliked. There's also another factor that Brian didn't touch on, which is the economic factor. Bouguereau, you said, why would Bouguereau be forgotten? Bouguereau painted 800 masterpieces in his lifetime. 800 works that they consider masterpieces. You contrast that by Picasso. Picasso has 80,000 works attributed to him.
Yeah, but what about the Impressionists?
I'll come back to the Impressionists. Just simple economics. If I can take an artist who can produce 800 works at best in his lifetime, and Bouguereau was prolific, or I can take somebody who can do 800 paintings in the next 2 years. If I can find a market for somebody who can paint 800 works or average 100 works a year, I'm going to make a whole lot more money than somebody who's only averaging.
So the movement comes down to money and marketing.
It does come down to money and marketing, because as the middle class has more expendable income and can buy work, it's not just the aristocracy, it's not just the establishment, but regular people who are making money as industrialists and farm owners growing tobacco, things of that nature, they can buy work. Now those people control the market, and you've got to fill their wall space. The Vanderbilts, all of those homes in New England.
No, not at that level. At that level, they could afford anything in the world.
But they were buying through dealers, and the dealers
but they weren't buying Impressionism.
Well, sure, some of those people put Impressionist
they were
collections
still buying,
together.
They did, but they were buying
family portraits. I had seen
family portraits. They also bought a lot of antique paintings.
Right, but you
when
have
they wanted a bigger one.
Who's the collection that's put together just outside of Philadelphia? That's all Impressionism. That was just a rich heiress that put that collection together. The Sterling Clark, which is academic work, was all put together by a private investor.
So the dealers were telling people these were good paintings.
Well, if a dealer who has a reputation as being somebody who's a pundit on art and knows a lot about art, and I as a buyer don't really know that much, I'm going to defer to a dealer.
To an expert.
And now that expert says, well, here's Cezanne. Well, Cezanne didn't really sell much when he was alive, but he did later on.